FM.
So, on the other side of my screen, we've got Glynn Tromans with us. He's the Boccia UK performance coach and a former player of athletics. So thank you for coming on, Glynn.
No problem. Thanks for asking.
As I do with all these podcasts, if you've ever seen them before, what was your early career in sports when you were younger?
Oh wow! Well, obviously I'm now quite old, so me being younger covers quite a lot of ground. As a schoolboy, I did every kind of sport. So I remember being at primary school and maybe what would now be called year 5, a new teacher came to the school. And so we did like touch rugby, we had a cricket team, we obviously did football, which was the sort of main sport where I grew up. We did rounders, probably others that I've forgot. Oh, cross country. We sort of we entered like Coventry schools cross country. So I kind of did any sport that was going. I was primarily a footballer, and I played football at a reasonable level, sort of up until maybe 15, 16. And I was doing athletics as a kind of sideline to that. And at that point, there was a change in manager at the club that I played for. It was clear I wasn't going to be a professional footballer, but I also found on a personal level that I kind of liked the idea of athletics and running, because whether you were successful or not, depending on your own efforts and what you put into it and how you responded to the circumstances, whereas as a footballer, it was very much you were reliant on everybody else. So probably from the age of 15, 16, I focused very much on athletics, and then I went on to have a reasonably successful athletics career as a senior runner.
So, and then you did have a very successful career. You managed to get 17 national and British titles on track, road, and country. Do you know how many exactly you got for track, road, and country individually, or is it just 17 in total?
In terms of titles, yeah. Probably. I mean, no, I don't know is the answer. I would have to rapidly try and work it out. I mean, I think track titles would have been the fewest, and cross-country titles would have probably been the most. I've won 5 UK titles and 3 English national titles. Road obviously covers a bigger spread. So all cross-country is 12 kilometres. All cross-country championships are 12 kilometres. Road would have had 10-mile half marathon, 10-kilometre championships built in, and track was over 10,000 metres. So yeah, probably cross-country most, road second, track third.
And so why did you focus on these particular 3 athletics?
Well, I was a distance runner, and my upbringing in running was very much based around cross country, because that was what we did at school, and it was something that I found to be incredibly natural as an activity. You know, you're sort of running out, whether it's in parks in the countryside, and you're just running free. You're not a slave to the clock and the stopwatch. So cross country was kind of the event which I was brought up on, and it's a kind of strongman sport, if you like. It's a tough old event, and when you compete in things like world cross country championships, you have the very best track runners, you have the very best road runners, and you have the very best cross country specialists all come together for the World Cross Country Championships, and I think that therefore marked a true representation of where you stood as a distance runner. So that was, and I think I was a long distance runner. so say 10,000 metres on the track was where I ended up to. That was where I would have competed in sort of European Games, Commonwealth Championships. I did World Championships up to the half marathon distance, and cross country, so it was 12 kilometres. So those were the distances that were available to me. That was what I was good at. That was what I trained for. And so, yeah, most of my adult life was spent running a lot of miles in a lot of different places around the world.
And so growing up, when I got to go into sort of late teens to early 20s, back in the 80s, I would have thought something like that. So how did you manage? How did you manage to go? How did you manage to juggle schoolwork and your sport? Was there much of a leeway between the two back then?
Yeah, I never ever felt it was a juggle. I always kind of felt that one complemented the other. So sort of as a teenager at school, I probably didn't train that. At that point, I was probably playing football 2 or 3 times a week and running 2 or 3 times a week. I think later, when I guess as a senior runner focused on running, I would have been at university, and then you just fit it in. Then you're train. I was training twice a day, and the same when I was working. So it was just the kind of thing that you needed to do, and I worked hard, and I was reasonably talented, but I wasn't the most talented. But I would probably say I worked as hard as anybody probably could. So, yeah, certainly by the back end of my career, I was probably training maybe 16 times a week and fitting that in around work as well. And so that's quite a lot of training. And that would be probably running 11 or 12, and the rest would be sort of gym based.
And GCSEs, A levels. I mean, what sort of? And then you mentioned university. What sort of degrees did you get? Because I know you ended up being a lecturer at school from 92 to 98. So
yeah. So we are going back. So I went to what was a fairly threadbare all boys comprehensive school. It was a big school, and back then, we would have had a yearly intake. So in my year, there would have been probably 350 boys, all sort of from the east side of Coventry, and a very working class kind of intake. And of those 350, probably 25 stayed on into sixth form. And some of them would have been doing retakes of GCSEs or O levels, as they probably were back then. So it's kind of there wasn't a great expectation, and again, a bit like the primary school teacher, there was a teacher came to my school when I was, I guess, a fifth year in old money, year 11, I think now, and he happened to be somebody who was a member of Coventry Godiva Harriers, a running club, and he started to influence me from a coaching perspective and also a lifestyle perspective, which again sort of showed me the kind of value of a kind of coach, mentor, supporter, somebody in your corner. And this guy kind of said, maybe I should stay on in sixth form, that might be good for my running, and do A levels. And I'd never really thought about it before. Growing up where I did, probably the natural route was to leave school at 15 and go and get an apprenticeship. So I stayed on in sixth form, and then I did A levels, and I did history, economics, and sociology. So very much on the social science side. But again, the nature of the school, in my history class, there were 5 from my school. Remember, 350 intake. There were 5. And we shared it with an all-girls school, so there were 10 of us, and I think I was the only one that actually passed. In sociology, I was the only one from my school, and we mixed with 2 other schools again, so we had a class size of about 16, but I was literally one out of, again, that big intake. And economics, I was literally the only one, and we didn't even have an economics teacher after the first year, and I got a student teacher, and we just used to sit and drink coffee and look at the textbooks. But I managed to get through that, I studied business studies in my degree. I worked for a bit. I got sponsored through my degree by what was Dunlop Aviation, who made wheel and brakes and manufacturing. I worked for them, but then ultimately decided work in that sense, industrial work, wasn't really for me. I love sport. I was starting to make progress from a running perspective. And so I then went to Loughborough to do a master's degree, and my master's was sort of sport and recreation management. So still on the management side, I was never a sports scientist in that regard, but started to lead into sport. And from there, I was kind of, I mean, Loughborough was a great place to be. There were great coaches, there were great athletes, there were it was a high performance environment, and probably the first time I'd really been in a high performance environment. And so it started to show what's possible. But after my master's degree, I was kind of overqualified and underexperienced for almost any job. So I kind of thought, what will I do while I work out what it is I really want to do? I went for a job teaching in a local further education college. I was teaching business, economics, and marketing, and I did that for 6 or 7 years, and also in higher education. So I was teaching on degree programs, but all in business-related subjects, mainly economics.
And during that time, you still did your running, but then you got a record 5 CAU/UK cross-country successes. So that must have been quite nice, you having a record.
Yeah. I mean, at the time, you're running races. And then I guess as your career goes on, people start to say, oh, when I've won 4 UK titles, they say, this equals the record from a guy that had done the same in like the 1930s. And so winning the 5th felt like quite a big deal. And it's kind of interesting because that was quite late in my career, and I was well into my 30s at the point that I was winning those titles. And I guess I felt I knew enough about how to prepare. I knew enough about my own strengths as a runner that I kind of felt I should win those races. So it's kind of, it's not really an ego thing, but when you work really hard and you know what you bring to the table, you kind of think, well, if I don't win this, somebody's gonna have to really dig deep and sort of get past me. And that was sort of the approach that I took. It was never I never took an easy route. I wanted to win or make somebody bleed a little bit. If that's the right thing to say, which it probably isn't. But that was my approach. I worked incredibly hard, and I made myself difficult to beat in those domestic athletics events.
And then during that time when you did all those, and then we went on, you were British champion in 2001 for the 10,000 meters, and then you went on. Before that, you represented England in '98 at the Commonwealth Games.
Yeah.
And that must have been quite nice. I mean, able to go on to that really, really high level of maybe not an Olympics, but a Commonwealth Games.
Yeah, and the Commonwealth Games changed things for me because I was working in education at that time, and my line manager, the head of the business department, wasn't exactly accommodating. So I went and said, I've been picked for the Commonwealth Games, this is great, but it was in September. And if you work in a college of further education, September is a big month. It's when all the new intake come, all the courses start, all the inductions are. And I was told I couldn't have the time off. And I would kind of say, look, if this isn't a request, the Commonwealth Games were in Kuala Lumpur, they're in Malaysia. It was a big deal for me to do a track championship. I'd already done World Cross Country Championships and European Cross Country Championships, and maybe by then I'd already done a World Half Marathon Championships as well. So I was already on the international sort of championship circuit, but it was my first track event sort of at a championship level. So it wasn't really a request, but ultimately the college refused to give me time off. They wouldn't even let me take it as unpaid leave, so I resigned. And fortunately, I was in a position where lottery funding had just started, and because of some events the previous year, I actually qualified and was eligible for lottery funding. So essentially, I mean, I was quite lucky in that the amount of lottery funding I got pretty much replaced the wage that I was picking up as a college lecturer. So I actually then for a couple of years I was able to be a full-time athlete, and I decided. I mean, so the Commonwealth Games was a real switching point for me in terms of what I was doing. Although again, interestingly, I found even though I was training a lot, being a full-time athlete didn't particularly suit me. You know, I was still getting up early in the morning to do morning training, sort of later breakfast, sort of you're then kind of watching daytime telly and waiting almost for the next training session. And I know there are things you can do to occupy your time, but I actually found actually having something was to occupy the brain cells as well as physically was better for me. So I actually sort of probably only lasted 2 years as a full-time athlete, and then I went in to get some part-time work doing athletics development. So within a local sports trust, what was the Greater Warwickshire Sports Trust, and I became an athletics development officer. So I was working then for the first time, maybe around sort of 2000 mark. I was working in sport for the first time in my life, and again that created opportunities that almost lead me to where I am now.
Well, it's funny you should say that because I was just about to say that. So you're world development officer, and then we can now go on to your 2001 British Championship. Now we can mention that in the 10,000 meters British champion. A nice achievement.
Yeah, and again that was the first track one, and I'd won again plenty on road and cross country, but such is the way sport is presented, that actually while winning cross-country titles may well be harder in many ways because there's bigger fields and there's more people around and it's a harder event, actually there's more kudos given to the track. So all through this time, I was getting better. And again, it's sort of I didn't really become a GB international till I was in my later 20s. So my a lot of the early part of my career was aspirational and being almost good enough, but not quite. But then my later 20s and through my 30s, I was then good enough. So my proper international career was really from almost the age of 26, 27 through to 36, 37. So that kind of later decade, which again I think is an interesting lesson, because even though I wasn't quite getting there, I was always aspirational and I always believed in myself. And again, a key point probably, again, relating it to coaching, which is what I do now, that teacher that came to my school when I was 15, he was my coach, a guy called David Dix. He was my coach throughout my entire career. Now, he was only at the school I taught for 1 year. He was never my teacher. I never had him in a classroom. But from the age of 15, 16 through to 36, 37, he was my coach. And I think that, again, you build that kind of relationship, that trust, that knowledge that that you sort of get collectively. And again, some of the, I guess, my experience as an athlete, working with Dave and with other coaches, with national coaches and with other coaches, because we were never particularly precious about where we got advice from. It kind of helps indicate to me some of the good things about coaching.
And during your time at the moment, obviously, you worked at UK Athletics. Obviously, you were still running at that point. So were you completing? Were you working? Were you looking out at younger athletes at that point, or were you just focusing on yourself, or were you still a member of staff there at those events during that?
So, really interesting. So when I was the athletics development officer, so that's working locally, there are events which still happen, which are called the Youth Games, and I think I was the first person as an athletics development officer to put events for disabled people into the Youth Games. So in the Greater Warwickshire Youth Games, as they were then called, we had a parallel event to the normal athletics events for people with disabilities. And I think, and I'm not absolutely certain, but I was the first person to do that. And it never felt, and I'd got no real experience of working with people with disabilities. But as part of my job as an athletics development officer, I did go into some special primary schools that were working with people with sort of physical disabilities, and I wanted to include these guys in the event. So that ultimately led to me being put on some kind of committee to help develop things within other sort of local authority sports partnerships and sports trusts. And after a couple of years, a job came up to work with UK Athletics on a new project, which is a world-class potentials programme for athletes with disabilities. And I was fairly well placed to go and do that, even though my actual knowledge and experience of working in that part of sport was quite limited. It was probably still more than most. So I ended up getting the job as assistant head of this new programme, working with an amazing coach, a guy who died a couple of years ago, but a guy called Brian Scobie, who was just the most fantastic athletics coach, both able-bodied and disabled. He headed the programme, and I supported him with that. And again, I was still competing at that time, but again, I always felt a bit like I was when I was a student, and at any other time, the two things complemented each other. You know, there's only so many hours in the day you can train, and you need to be able to do other things and exercise your mind. So yeah, a lot of the athletes that ultimately went on further down the line to compete in London 2012 and beyond, and even Beijing, there were a couple, came out of that first World Class Potentials programme with athletics. So it kind of brought me into a world that I didn't know particularly well, and obviously I'm still in that world, albeit in a different sport.
And so what made you think I'm going to do this for disabled people? How does that come about?
Well, again, it felt like a natural thing. It was more accident than plan, as so many things are. So by virtue of doing one thing that was inclusive, I got asked to be involved in enabling that inclusivity elsewhere. That led to a job that put me directly in the path of sort of future Paralympic athletes. Yeah, it didn't feel like it was a choice that says this is where I want to be, but it felt like a fairly natural path. And of course, in my time working with British Athletics, I worked on both Paralympic and Olympic programs subsequently, and yeah, and obviously with Boccia now it's purely Paralympic. But yeah, it just because you start to build up a body of knowledge, you start to be viewed as an expert, if that's the right term, or somebody who knows a little bit more than other people, and yeah, suddenly you find yourself in positions where you can influence policy, you can influence the way things are delivered, you can influence, I guess, the experience of athletes positively, and it was a world that, say, 20 years ago I didn't know at all. But now I feel very much a part of and love it. Yeah.
So you were world class talent manager and all that. you did that for 1 year from 2008 to 2009. Then you joined Boccia UK, or CP Sport, or whatever it was back then. So here's an interesting question. So how did Boccia came about? You know, why did you want to leave the athletics? How did you get into Boccia?
Yeah, great question, and I think it's hopefully I'll find a good answer to it. So on the run into the Beijing Games, UK Athletics restructured, and they kind of wanted to integrate the Olympic and Paralympic programs. Now, I was the performance manager for the Paralympic program, and so that kind of integration meant that such a role no longer existed. But the then performance director, basically said, you know, in these combined roles, is there any area that particularly interested me? Is there anything I particularly like to do? And I said, well, I'm really interested in talent development. I've worked in development. I've worked in Paralympic performance, and there was a job that was available, if you like, as part of this restructure to be talent manager at Loughborough. So became a world-class talent manager across Olympic and Paralympic programs combined, based at the High Performance Centre in Loughborough. So that kind of happened in that sort of winter almost of 2007, 2008. After Beijing, it felt like UK Athletics panicked a little bit, and they started to change again the structure. They changed the way they wanted to deliver talent. Now, I'd been in this talent role for 15 months or so at Loughborough, and I'd signed up to what I thought was a 6-year long programme, effectively, where you're going to work with the most talented 16, 17, 18, whatever, teenagers, early 20s, the most talented athletes, athletes with the most potential to grow and develop and be our future senior medalists, and be part of a process that was going to transform those athletes into senior medalists by the time they're in their mid-20s. And that long-term athletic development was what I was really bought into, and why I'd taken that job. On the run into the London Games, I think athletics panicked and felt they had to bring in lots of new faces. They got rid of some very good people, and they kind of felt they had to do something different. And in that sphere of development and talent, I really struggled to align myself with whatever the new vision was that they wanted. You know, the targets for junior medals and the, you know, this long-term athletic development seemed to go out the window, and they wanted performance now, which is easy to do. You get the people with the best times and you make them train really hard. They'll get medals now, but they won't necessarily progress and be great seniors. So I just really struggled to align myself with the culture and the end goal that UK Athletics had at the time. So I started to really have a little bit of a look and see if there was anything else out there. And Boccia were one of several sports that were looking for somebody to do a talent program for London 2012. So I kind of went from athletics to Boccia. I met with the then performance director, Matt Hammond. I met with Anthony Hughes, who I know died earlier this year, who was, I think, then chair of GB Boccia, as it was then called, to see what this sport was all about. And decided I would leave athletics and go and do this 1-year contract with Boccia to set up and run a fast track talent program to try and fill some performance gaps for London. And that was all it was, really. I was unhappy with the direction of athletics at that time, and felt that this would give me a bit of leeway, actually, to do something else that was different. And I could also work out what it is that I wanted to do while I was in that year. But as it turned out, I fell in love with Boccia that first talent program was successful. We got some good players. I was asked if I would manage that group through London 2012, and then after London 2012, I became the first full-time boccia coach that the UK had. So it kind of came out of an uneasiness with culture and the direction of travel of athletics, an opportunity in a sport I knew absolutely nothing about, but actually then sort of fell in love with once I worked out how it functioned and the people in it and so on. So yeah, here I am, best part of 13 years later, still trying to work out my 1-year contract. But yeah, it's so that was, again, it was literally the first thing that came up when I started to look, and it was the only interview that I did, and yeah, it's just such an amazing place to be.
And with that, after your 1-year contract, obviously kept you on. Was it on a longer contract this time?
It was to see the squad through the London Games. So if that first year contract went from the end of 2009 to the end of 2010, when that talent program came to an end, I was then asked, would I manage that group, the BC3 group in particular, through the London Games, which I did. So that took me through from 2010 through to 2013, but it was fairly clear by that point that there was a longer term future there. So and then I think watching London 2012 from the stands, because I wasn't the on-court coach. I was effectively a performance manager of the BC3 group. I worked with the then coach, and it was kind of a really interesting experience to be watching it, but without having a direct influence on it on the ground. And it kind of felt fairly obvious to me that the way the sport was developing and the way UK Boccia, or GB Boccia as it was called back then, was developing, we needed to have, I guess, we needed to professionalise the coaching side of it. And that's not to disregard the amazing work that all of those coaches had done before. I just think that the sport was moving to a point where it needed more. And I think that for both the performance director and for me, watching London 2012 said, no, this needs to change in terms of how we professionalise coaching. And that ultimately led to me being offered a job, and then subsequently Claire Morrison as our other performance coach becoming, I guess, the second sort of professional coach in Boccia. And Claire was already involved at that time as well as a support coach. So yeah, it was quite a strange leap, and in all honesty, I knew so little about Boccia when I came to it, and it would almost, even though I'd worked in that Paralympic world, I'd probably, if I'd heard of Boccia, I didn't really know what it was, which is still the case today, unfortunately, for a lot of people, but not so much for me now.
Yes, no, not for us, no. And then, who was in that London 2012 group that you oversaw? I know it was definitely Smithy there. Nigel Murray, Zoe Robinson, Dan Bentley.
Yeah, I mean, I worked less with those guys because I'd come from the talent, and right. the team were already Paralympic champions. So the team had won in Beijing. So what the talent program was trying to do was to fill performance gaps. And if you kind of think, I think the BC4s who'd got Steph and Peter Maguire were already world class with those two. The team were already world class with the people that you mentioned, and they were Paralympic champions. The BC3s were actually nowhere really prior to that talent program, but they hadn't qualified for Beijing. And certainly while I was doing the talent program, I think in 2009, before I came on, I think there must have been a regional championships, and they'd lost every match and they finished like last. And in 2010, when I actually did the talent program, there was the World Championships, and again, I think they lost every match. So at the point I started working with the BC3s, they were ranked 23rd in the world, and this is 2011. They had finished, I think maybe Scott was the only player, Scott McCowan, was the only player ranked in the top 100. I don't think we had any players in the top 50. Definitely the pair were ranked 23rd in the world. We'd done very badly in the 2009 Europeans and the 2010 Worlds, and then I took over in 2011. So I was really working with the BC3s with a view to trying to get them competitive, and we changed the way, the squad changed, the personnel changed. People like Jacob Thomas and Jess Hunter came out of that first talent program that I did. I mean, there were throwers as well, but they came out of that program, and they joined Scott and C Turk, who's in the squad as well. We went to our first World Championships in 2011 fairly naively. I'd got no experience of international boccia. I'd literally ran a talent program, and found some people who I thought could be good players. And then, with all of those bad results that had gone before, we finished 6th at that first World Championships in 2011, and then we went to London and we finished 5th. And then in 2013 we got our first medal when we got a bronze at the European Championships. 2014 we got to the final of the World Championships, and we got beat by Korea in the final, but a silver medal at the World Championships. And by 2015 we were world number 1. So that was my journey with the BC3s, if you like. And I didn't really start working with any throwers other than in talent programs, where I worked across the board, until I started working with David at the back end of 2016, David Smith. So it was all, my first part was either talent, which was across the classifications, or I was working predominantly with BC3 players, the ramp players.
So were you drafted in with the BC3s just because they needed talent to run up from the bad results onwards?
I mean, if I think back, and again we're going back a fair number of years.
Yes.
Essentially, it was some sports. For London 2012, we had automatic entry because we were the hosts, and some sports did not have necessarily the performance levels that were going to make them competitive. So there were, and I'm sure it was perhaps similar across Olympic sport, but there were a few initiatives in Paralympic sport, of which boccia was one, where when I came in, my remit was to run a talent program for London 2012 with an emphasis on BC3s, and we did also find team players. So somebody like Joshua Rowe came into the squad after that first talent program as a BC2. Jamie Doherty came in as a BC4. So we weren't exclusively BC3s, but the remit was to say our BC4s are already very competitive. Peter and Steph Maguire were very good. Our team with Nigel, David, Dan, Zoe were already Paralympic champions. BC3s weren't there. BC3s were not qualifying. They were going to events and they were losing all the matches. So it was an open talent program. Let's see who's there. But if there's an emphasis, let's put it on the BC3s, because that's where the talent gap is. And I was probably, again, quite lucky. I think Jacob Thomas was just a phenomenal young player, new to BC3, and only 15 or so at the time. And he went on to be world number 1, a world medalist. And Jess also came out of that. Of course, in the next talent program that I did after London, we added to the squad with Patrick Wilson, who's obviously still going now and will be heading to the European Championships in a couple of weeks' time, with a real shot. So the BC3 squad just became something that grew and developed and morphed from one thing into another, and that's still the case.
And did you? I know, but Boccia England came in about 11 years ago. In between 2012. Do you ever work with them to look at what other grassroots players that you could potentially pick up on?
I mean, certainly back then, I would have worked. Certainly when I was doing the talent stuff, I would have worked very closely with Boccia England and all the other home countries, because we're looking for players. Who are the people out there? Now we have in Liz Wilkes, Liz Fisher, sorry. I sometimes forget Liz got married a few years ago. So with Liz Fisher, we have a pathways lead who will work with all of the home countries in that kind of space, and now with Michaela as a pathways coach who we employ for 70 days a year. So there are people other than me and Claire who are sort of who have specific roles. But of course, if there are interesting players, if there are people that you kind of look sort of outside of the world-class program and think, here's somebody that's really interesting and I think we can work with, and somebody like Sally, who you said has done one of these podcasts with you, would be that kind of thing where Lauren as her coach and a Boccia England coach would highlight, here's somebody that might be worth a look. I would make sure I then go and take a look. And again, Sally's now on the world class programme and also heading to the European Championships next week in quite a quick turnaround from that. Okay. So the work with the home countries is absolutely vital, and England's is the biggest of those. And while I'll keep half an eye, and certainly I would probably like to do more certainly in terms of coach development, and sort of working with, having a strategy for coaching that covers the whole of the UK, not just in bits and pieces. But I think we have to be linked, because you have to remember UK Boccia is a federation, and our task is to deliver medals and look after the players at the very top end of the sport. We're not a governing body with responsibility for the whole sport, so we have to work really closely with the home countries, and it's really crucial work for the future of the sport.
And it's interesting that you said that you work with the home countries, because they do amazing work. And Northern Ireland used to be a development type thing up until 2015, I heard from Claire. So obviously before it wasn't touched upon, and then now Northern Ireland have got a massive remit for Boccia now. So
well, I mean, Northern Ireland's is an interesting one because they're smaller as an organisation, but I mean, they existed. I mean, I think I first saw Claire maybe in 2013, and I went over. So Oren, who was the person responsible for Boccia at that time, it's now Terry, but Oren was responsible for Boccia. And when I was looking for people for the 2013 talent programme, the post-London one, I went over to what was then called the Ulster squad, and Claire Taggart was somebody relatively new to Boccia who was in that squad, and so the squad exists, but it was very embryonic. It wasn't Paralympic specific, it wasn't classification specific, and there were some people in it who would have a Paralympic classification if they went for it, and some that wouldn't. So it was an opportunity to get Boccia going, and Oren was definitely a big part of kickstarting that. But Claire was one in that who was just really interesting, and she was I guess labelled, if that's the right term, as a BC4 at that particular time, and I wasn't sure she was a BC4, but I know I came back and saying, look, there's one player in particular that's really interesting from Northern Ireland. I'm not quite sure where she fits from a classification perspective, but I think we should keep an eye and we should have a look. And that was Claire Taggart back in 2013. So she didn't come onto that talent programme, but we did invite her maybe a year later to come to the British Championships, as part of the Northern Ireland group, and we made sure that she was looked at, and then Dawn Ibrahim, who was then our head physio, said, well, actually she could be a BC2, and other kind of investigations started to follow in terms of but yeah, so Northern Ireland has been around for a decade delivering boccia, but I think it's kind of really important that all the home countries are delivering boccia, that we don't become reliant on one or the other. So I think people like Claire, and obviously we have Robin now, who's also part of the Northern Ireland squad, also on the world class programme. So we have two people from Northern Ireland who are sort of going to be travelling to the European Championships as part of the British squad. And I just think it's really, really important that we get that representation, because if you have representation, then other people in those areas start to see what's possible, and other people start to be drawn into our sport. And so, yeah, you can't overstate how important the work that happens in the home countries is to what we are able to deliver at a world-class programme. Because if we don't have players, we can't do anything.
Yeah, because people never realise what happens behind the scenes. They just normally just see people on the court playing. They never actually see or hear what goes on behind the scenes. It's very fascinating.
Yeah, and it's a long journey. So again, somebody like David Smith, who would have started with England, started playing as a young kid and had success early. He went to Beijing as a teenager and got a team gold medal there, but he didn't actually win an individual medal till 2016, an individual Paralympic medal, and he obviously repeated that in Tokyo. And will be obviously trying to become a three-time individual Paralympic medalist in Paris next year. But it's a long old journey that goes, people don't just pick up bocce balls. And again, Claire, I'm not sure how long she'd been throwing when I saw her back in 2013. But again, she obviously won her first world title last year, and that's 8 or 9 years after she was first spotted and thought of as interesting, if that's a term that fits Claire. So it's a long old journey. You don't, and it's an incredibly competitive sport globally, internationally. The ranking lists go very, very deep. You have to put the hours in. You have to train hard. But yeah, there's a lot of work happens at all sorts of levels with all sorts of different people before they get into what becomes the shop window, which is the sort of the world boccia level events.
And I've always wanted to ask, I'm doing a Paralympic documentary at the moment, and one question I did actually ask a few of them already, and I thought I might just ask this on this podcast, is you obviously there from 2012 from London to Rio, a normal 4-year cycle. Rio to Tokyo is a 5-year cycle. I mean, so and I know you do mainly talent, but how was it going from a 4-year cycle and then having to stop 2020 to, I mean, it must be quite strange to have a long rest, because normally a 4-year cycle is very hectic, it never ever stops. So how did the pandemic, did it help? Did it not?
I think the pandemic helped some and not others, and I think it's a personality driven thing in many ways. It certainly wasn't a rest. I think we worked really hard during the pandemic to maintain contact with players, to find ways for players to practice and to train, to try and bring people together when we could, and there were some places that stayed open. So Sophia Gardens in Cardiff enabled David Smith to travel from Swansea to Cardiff, and also Will Arnott travelled up from Reading to Cardiff, and it was kind of one of very few places where you could actually still train, but all in a very safe, socially distanced way. There was hardly anybody in the building. Will and David couldn't train together to start with, so I was seeing, say, David in the morning and Will in the afternoon. We were doing lots of online stuff. There was lots of meetings. There was lots of check-ins, and yeah, everybody's in a slightly different position. And some players who are quite insular, self-driven, very comfortable, doing repetitive kind of work would have thrived in that kind of environment because it was just them and their bocce balls in a space. Some people who are perhaps more sort of socially driven and like the contact with other people and training partners and so on may have struggled a little bit in that time, and we just had to try and manage that the best way we could. And then, because things opened up not long before Tokyo, so then it became quite a bit of a not a rush, but to try and get people ready for it. So yeah, it was definitely not a rest. Everybody trained, everybody still did their conditioning, everybody was still throwing balls, everybody still had coach contact. It was just done very differently and it suited some people and it didn't suit other people. And I think that was a reality of it. But Tokyo was still an absolutely amazing games, and it's a shame because bocce is such a massive sport in Japan. You know, we'd have been playing in front of 11,000 people every day, and it's a shame that we didn't get that. But the sports that were there close to the courts in this big arena that was otherwise empty, we still managed to create a really good atmosphere, and I think we had really great championships. So yeah, the pandemic obviously affected everybody, but I think staff and players within UK Boccia just did a tremendous job just keeping in touch with everybody and keeping everybody motivated. But there would always be winners and losers in that kind of environment.
And we just mentioned that athletes got an exemption card, didn't they? They got exemption cards to say, I'm allowed to go out. When others couldn't.
So that existed, but you still needed a venue to train in, and most venues weren't open. So I think there were only, and of course we couldn't fly, and so I couldn't have gone over to Belfast to work with any of those players or easily get up to Scotland. But somewhere like Sophia Gardens allowed that opportunity for some players to work out of there, and there were little pockets like that. So yes, the elite athletes did get that exemption that allowed them to train as long as there was a venue for them to train in, which certainly wasn't always the case. So a lot of people, and also there were, again, it's that as I'm talking, remembering back that a lot of the players in boccia would have been quite vulnerable to COVID symptoms, and therefore, even if they had the exemption, didn't feel safe to go out because COVID was potentially deadly to them because of their underlying conditions. And I think so. That was also the case, that the exemption just didn't mean that we all went out and trained in sports halls, because that wasn't the case. It was actually quite limited, either because of venues or through choice and people's, I guess, view on their own personal safety. And we never press ganged or sort of or required anybody. There was always that free will as to when it was right. And I know even when we had our first training camp, when we were allowed to do that, some players still stayed away because they didn't feel it was appropriate yet to start mixing with others. So and that was fine. And I think that was an impact. So definitely elite sport was impacted by the pandemic, but not in a uniform way.
And going from Tokyo to Paris, obviously it's a 3-year cycle and not a normal 4-year cycle. So did you have to squeeze everything from a 4-year cycle into your food, or was there anything you had to take out or make some changes?
Yeah, I would definitely have liked this to have been a 4-year cycle rather than a 3-year cycle. I think we also had a lot of rule changes, the separation of the genders, so we stopped being a mixed sport in terms of how people are competing, the getting rid of substitutes and having mixed pairs. A lot of those kind of fundamental rule changes actually impacted us in different ways, and the same with other countries around the world. And we also had the fact that our world championships were very late in, we sort of went from the Paralympics to a European Championships, and then almost straight into a season, because the European Championships were in December or something, straight into a season the following year with very little prep time to change anything. And then the World Championships were also right in December of 22. So we never really got that transitional phase to really get a hold of things. So we definitely did that last winter, and certainly with BC3s, but with the other classifications as well, because we've got new pairings, we've got new rules, we've got new systems that we're competing under, and we never quite had the opportunity. So yeah, I would have liked 4 years rather than 3 years to get that right. And of course now we're in the midst of trying to qualify, and the next couple of events become really, really important for certainly BC3s and BC4s. I think the team are in a much stronger position, but yeah, it's a 4-year cycle. You can definitely see why it's a 4-year cycle when one of those years is taken away.
And I mentioned Paris already. You've got LA in 28. You've got Brisbane, Australia in 32. But let's just focus on next year, because obviously this is closest. Paris. How do you think the thing's going to go for you for the BC3s?
Well,
because I know the McLaren brothers have retired now, so you've got a new team coming in, haven't you?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, probably the Sally and Robin are relatively new as the two female players. Will is new to the world class program, but not new to Boccia. He's been playing a while, and we've been working with him. You know, he did his first event in 2019, and potentially that international development was halted by the pandemic. Paddy, of course, has been around since the 2013 talent program, so he's been involved with us for a decade. And obviously, I'm coaching David Smith and Claire Taggart as well. So it's kind of they're going to be good to go, and they'll be incredibly competitive, and as long as they're enjoying their boccia, they'll go and do great, and whatever that looks and feels like. BC3s, we have to qualify, you know, and we've got a series of events coming up where that's our task. So I don't want to get ahead and say we're going to do this, but I will say we've got a bunch of incredible players, and I think as and when we make it to Paris, we'll go in with a lot of optimism about how well we can do. But our task is to qualify at this particular point, and that's not a done deal. That's a difficult task.
Well, I will certainly be looking forward to that next week or in a couple of weeks' time when it comes along. I'm going to be really interested by that. And the future of you. I mean, obviously, it will still be Boccia for you in the near future, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Because I know that you're still looking quite closely into the athletics. You're still looking around, seeing how players are doing in the athletics as well. You're still connected with that, aren't you? Just looking.
Not so much. I mean, I keep an arm's length view of athletics, and I think athletics is a sport where I spent most of my life. So whether it's Olympic or Paralympic, I still have an interest in how they're doing. But no, if anybody asks me what my sport is, my sport's boccia. You know, without any hesitation whatsoever. And boccia is absolutely at the heart of the Paralympic movement. I think it's an incredibly important sport. I think for people with complex disabilities, and I think the Paralympics is enriched because boccia exists, and so yeah, it's definitely the sport for me.
Definitely. But thank you very much for agreeing to do this. I just thought I'll give you a quick text to see if you were interested. I know you're very, very busy, so thank you very much for taking some time.
No problem at all. Cheers, Peter.
Voice FM.
Definitely, and sorry about that again. I have to cut that bit out, and yeah, so thank you. Sorry. I
think you should leave that bit in.
Well, I'll be watching this back and having a look.